In the wake of the shootout between federal agents and the Dillinger Gang at the Little Bohemia Lodge in northern Wisconsin, the United States government passed several crime bills that gave J. Edgar Hoover's men at the Bureau of Investigation extensive powers to unleash hellfire in the war on crime. John Dillinger was Hoover's supreme target, and he and his agents ramped up efforts to catch Johnny and his fellow gangmates, Homer Van Meter, George Babyface Nelson, Thomas Tommy Carroll, and Arthur Pat Riley. Dillinger was still reeling from the loss of his lieutenant John Red Hamilton, who'd been shot during their escape from the Little Bohemia Lodge. Despite law enforcement's best efforts to turn Dillinger into a master villain, Johnny received a lot of public support. However, with his face splashed across newspapers and movie screens, he became too recognizable. He needed to change his face. I'm Yvette. This is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 11 of the story of John Dillinger, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. John Dillinger had tasked his lawyer Lewis Pickett to find him a surgeon and a hideout where he could recover afterward. Pickett negotiated a deal with Dr. Ralph Robain, whose real name was Dr. Wilhelm Loser, a German immigrant who had studied medicine at Kansas and Northwestern universities. He'd done a year and a half in Leavenworth Prison for violating the Harrison Narcotics Act, but was paroled in 1932. He divorced his wife, took the name Dr. Ralph Robain, and returned to Chicago, where Pickett hired him to perform cosmetic surgery on a con man named William Elmer Meade. Loser, always in need of money, had recently asked Pickett if anyone Dillinger needed his fingerprints removed. He just developed a special technique. Pickett asked him to do a lot more. The doctor asked for $5,000 and an assistant for the surgery. Pickett's investigator, Arthur O'Leary, contacted his cousin, who had assisted Loser in Meade's surgery, 32-year-old Dr. Harold Bernard Cassidy. The University of Illinois Medical School graduate performed various illegal procedures in his North Side office to make money. His ex-wife pestered him for alimony constantly, and he was chronically in need of cash. O'Leary offered him $600 to assist in the surgery and 6 days of post-surgery checkups. That's pretty high. What's the matter with him? He's a red hot. That's all you need to know. Finding a hideout was more challenging. Ever since becoming Johnny's lawyer, Pickett received many offers from people who wanted to harbor the famous outlaw to make a quick buck. But he felt he could only trust one, an underworld figure he'd represented in court, James Jimmy Probasco. In underworld circles, Probasco had a reputation for always beating raps. He wanted to buy the Green Log Tavern and offered his place to get the cash he needed. Pickett warned him that he risked 2 years for conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, and if the police ever raided the place, they'd shoot him with the rest of them. Jimmy said, "Hell, I'm not afraid. I'm an old man. I'm telling you, Mr. Pickett, I have to raise some money. If you see Dillinger, speak to him about me and tell him the price is $50 a day." On the evening of May 27, 1934, Tommy Carroll drove John Dillinger to Jimmy Probasco's place at 2509 Crawford Avenue in his tan Hudson sedan. The old two-story cottage on Chicago's north side, an industrial area, was somewhat concealed by a green hedge in front and a fence around the back. In the backyard, Probasco kept 2 retired police dogs, King and Queen. Johnny was early, and Jimmy hadn't been told anyone was coming, so Dillinger paced up and down the sidewalk until Lewis Pickett and Art O'Leary finally drove up. When a stunned Probasco opened the door, Pickett told him, "Jimmy, this is my famous client, John Dillinger. Have you got some place where we can all sit down and talk?" Probasco nervously shook the outlaw's hand, and everyone sat down in the kitchen. Dillinger looked around. "So, this is it. Have you worked out the price, Mr. Pickett?" "Jimmy says it'll cost you $50 a day." "Don't you think that's high?" Probasco interrupted. "Well, you're pretty hot, you know, but I want you to be satisfied. What do you think is fair?" Dillinger said, "How about $35 a day?" "That's all right with me. $35 a day then for room and board." At Dillinger's urging, the doctors would come to Probasco's house the following day. Suddenly, a 30-something woman entered the kitchen from the back room to go to the bathroom. Dillinger was stunned. "Who's the broad?" Oh yeah, that was his housekeeper girlfriend, Peggy Doyle, a nurse who worked during the day. Should she leave? Nah, she'd seen his face. Better let her stay. Probasco showed Dillinger the front bedroom with a fold-out couch where he could sleep. Dillinger went straight to bed. On May 28, 1934, Jimmy Probasco gave the place and the bathroom a thorough cleaning and laid out a cot for the surgery in the front bedroom. Harold Cassidy arrived with Art O'Leary and Dr. Wilhelm Lozer, who carried a black bag with his surgical tools. John Dillinger told Lozer to remove 3 moles on his face and fill in a depression on the bridge of his nose. He also wanted Lozer to remove a scar on the left side of his upper lip and the infamous cleft from his chin. The doctor examined the gangster's heart and asked if he wanted a local or a general anesthetic. Dillinger hesitated. A general would put me completely out, wouldn't it? Yes, it would. Dillinger turned to O'Leary, unable to trust anyone in the room. They might make more money if they turned him in while he was under. Are you gonna be here, Art? I'll stay if you want me, Johnny. I want you to stay. O'Leary was unarmed, but he knew where Dillinger's guns were. Dillinger decided on general anesthesia, and the physician asked whether he had eaten much that day. Just grapefruit toast and a cup of coffee for breakfast. Listeners, Dillinger had eaten a full meal just an hour earlier, but he didn't want to wait. Public service announcement. Kids, don't lie like this. Anesthesia on anything less than an empty stomach can kill you. Dillinger took off his shirt and lay down on the cot. Dr. Lozer went to the bathroom to sterilize his hands, while Cassidy placed a cone wrapped in a towel over Dillinger's face and gradually poured a can of ether over it. Dillinger kept asking, "Are you there, Art?" O'Leary said, "I'm right with you, Johnny. Try and relax." Well, Dillinger wasn't relaxed and seemed to be fighting the anesthetic. 2 minutes in, he was still semi-conscious. John's breakfast caused a reaction to the anesthesia. Cassidy now dunked the contents of the entire ether can over the cone to try to put him under. Too much too quickly. Dillinger's breath halted, his face turned blue, and his heart stopped. Cassidy turned white as his sheet, panicked, and backed away. O'Leary asked, "What is it?" "He's not breathing." O'Leary shouted for Lozer. The doctor raced in. Johnny had swallowed his tongue. Lozer used the forceps to pull it out, kicked the gangster's elbows into his chest, and administered CPR. Probasco, alarmed by the commotion, stood in the doorway, shouting, "My God, he's dead! Oh my God, oh my God!" O'Leary threw open the bedroom window so the fumes could escape, then hushed Probasco. It took nearly 15 minutes before Dillinger was fully revived. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. No one doubted what Homer Van Meter and Babyface Nelson would do had Dillinger died on the table. They'd never believe they hadn't betrayed him. With Dillinger stabilized, they continued under local anesthetic. Lozer began. It was slow going. Dillinger, still groggy, winced and squirmed with every cut. He bled so much that he soaked the bed, and his violent vomiting throughout the surgery slowed the doctors down. Lozer removed 3 facial moles, fixed the nose and the chin, and gave Dillinger a facelift, then sutured the incisions. When he was done, Dillinger's face, wrapped in gauze bandages, looked like a bloody mummy. An hour later, Johnny woke up. He'd hardly felt any pain. And then O'Leary told him, "Well, there's something I want to tell you. You pretty nearly died on us. We had a hell of a time bringing you back." Despite his swollen face, Dillinger managed to chuckle and said, "It might just as well have been now as some other time." Dr. Lozer left and Dr. Cassidy remained at the house. 2 days later, Cassidy removed the bandages during one of the checkups. Dillinger stared at his bruised face in a mirror. The telltale cleft was gone, as were the moles. He smiled. He looked like a new man. The press had gotten used to Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach's many updates, but Special Agent in charge of the Chicago field office, Melvin Purvis, hardly spoke to them. They had to sell their newspaper somehow, so clickbait and fabricated stories for the win. Director Hoover fumed when he read a news item saying that Bessie Green, wife of slain gangster Eddie Green, was helping federal agents in the Dillinger case. Purvis? Melvin wrote him the story was concocted by the newspaper men. Hoover wrote on the report, "Strange they should concoct the truth." In another article, an Indiana doctor who claimed to have treated Dillinger for 3 serious wounds quoted Purvis as saying, "Dillinger has been buried in southern Indiana. It has convinced us that he really is dead." "Purvis?" Melvin wired back, "It's all a lie. He never made a statement that Dillinger was dead, because primarily I do not believe that he is dead." Hoover didn't believe Purvis. Then another blunder. Purvis had put Agent Ed Hollis in charge of watching Helen Gillis, Babyface Nelson's wife, and Jean Delaney, Tommy Carroll's lady, who were staying at Babyface Nelson's sister's house in Chicago. But the ladies knew they were being watched, so Purvis looked for someone who could get close to them. He found a Michigan City parolee named George Nelson who said he'd done time with John Dillinger and that Lester Gillis, aka George Babyface Nelson, had stolen his name. Purvis paid convict Nelson $20 a day to make first contact. He pulled up to the apartment just as Helen and Jean were leaving. So, he had a message from Dillinger and Babyface? Both ladies could smell he was a G-Man plant a mile off. Convict Nelson shadowed the ladies, but when Helen went into a movie theater, he waited in his car outside. Well, neither woman ever returned to the apartment. On June 2nd, Purvis called Hoover to tell him his men had lost track of the 2 women. Purvis! Hoover was done. Later that day, the director told one of his top aides, Agent Samuel Cowley, "Be a dear, go to Chicago and check what the hell is wrong with Purvis and his men. Stay on Dillinger, go everywhere the trail takes you. Take everyone who was ever remotely connected with the gang. Take him alive if you can, but protect yourself." Cowley was the opposite of the charismatic, energetic Purvis, a beige, joyless Washington bureaucrat. Cowley, from a prominent Mormon family in Utah, got his law degree from George Washington University. When he couldn't find a lawyer job in Utah, he applied for a bureau job until the economy improved. A true desk jockey workaholic, he caught Hoover's eye with his relentless attempts to improve the Bureau's filing system. He soon became one of the director's most trusted aides in Washington. Sunday morning, June 3rd, Cowley arrived in Chicago and made a beeline for the banker's building. Purvis wasn't in yet, but Cowley immediately went to work. First, he debriefed the men who watched the Helen Gillis trace. It was shoddy work, and Cowley told them so. When Purvis arrived, he stood up for his agent. Sure, mistakes had been made, but his men were solid. Cowley reassigned 3 of the 4 men watching Helen and Jean and drove to the stakeout at Audrey Russ's home in Fort Wayne, Indiana that afternoon. Except the agents weren't there, but in a hotel 12 miles away. Mrs. Russ was expecting house guests and shooed them away with a promise she'd call if Dillinger showed up. Great. Useless. Cowley ordered the 4 agents back to Chicago. On June 5th, Cowley drove to Indianapolis and toured the Mooresville area with Special Agent in charge Earl Connolly. Connolly's 16 agents were as ineffective as Purvis's men, but Cowley told Hoover they were cool. Hoover liked the take-charge Cowley and seemed pleased for the first time in weeks. Cowley's assignment was presented as an inspection tour, and newspapers referred to him as Purvis's assistant. But at the banker's building, everyone knew he was there to replace Melvin, all but entitled. Hoover confirmed this. Until we complete the Dillinger investigation, I want Mr. Cowley to take complete charge. To add insult to injury, Hoover sent Cowley 5 additional agents that Purvis had requested but never received, and 8 more by the end of the month. Purvis's secretary Doris Rogers noticed a change in her boss and saw morale at the field office drop at what they considered Washington's betrayal. What was Hoover even thinking, sending a noob who knew nothing about no one in Chicago? Doris said, "We all felt under siege. The enemy was moving in. The friends we had in Washington had all turned into enemies." The men trusted Purvis and mostly ignored Cowley. They were already on the verge of quitting. Most agents were lawyers, as per Hoover's design, who hadn't chosen a career in law enforcement, but a relatively safe post-college gig, while they waited for regular jobs to return after the Depression. Now they'd become soldiers in the war against crime. But unlike regular servicemen, they'd never get medals of honor. They'd only get dead. On the same day Sam Cowley arrived in Chicago, Homer Van Meter followed John Dillinger into the brave new world of cosmetic surgery for the neat sum of $5,000. He showed up at the house with his arsenal and stashed it in the room's closet with Dillinger's arsenal, which now held 4 machine guns, 4 large-caliber rifles, and 8 pistols, all .45s except for one .38, which Dillinger sometimes carried in his pants pocket. They had 3 bulletproof vests, as Van Meter always wore 2 when on a job, plus a ton of ammo. No one knows where they got them. Dillinger was carless at this time, but Van Meter parked his dark maroon Ford sedan in the fenced-in backyard. Probasco kept 2 cars there, but the outlaws never used them. Van Meter haggled his Airbnb price down to $25 a day. Probasco offered to buy them a bed, but the fugitives, used to sleeping on prison bunks, in the back of a truck, and even on the floor, were fine with the arrangement. Once again, Dr. Lozer came to the cottage to perform the procedure, with a rather reluctant Dr. Cassidy assisting. This time everything went smoothly, but under local anesthesia, which only partially blocked the pain, Van Meter suffered. Lozer gave Van a nose job and a lip job, transformed a recognizable scar on his forehead, then used acid to remove the blue and red Good Hope anchor tattoo on his right forearm. Because who needs hope at a time like this? Unlike Dillinger, Van Meter was dissatisfied with Lozer's work. What a mess they made out of me. I paid out $5,000, and what did I get for it? When John told him that he was satisfied with his new face, he said, "You got a good job, I got a rotten one." When Pickett heard about Van Meter's rage, Lozer quickly came in to mess up his face some more. His face just wasn't as easy to alter as Dillinger's. He also used some fancy knife work along with his famed solution of hydrochloric acid, nitrohydrochloric acid, and caustic soda to remove Van Meter's fingerprints. Dillinger's had been done a few days before. Whereas Johnny, though grimacing and sweating, had endured the treatment in silence, Van couldn't stop cursing. He hopped around the room, flapping his hands to fight the pain. Neither man could use their hands for a few days. Babyface Nelson dropped by and smirked. "So, you two decided to go out and buy yourselves a pair of new mugs. Maybe you needed them." Dillinger grinned. "At least I'll be able to go out in the street and get around now." "Not yet, champ. First heal a bit, will ya?" "Yeah. No." Life at the cottage was perfectly average. Jim Probasco, quite the chef, prepared all the meals. A few times a week, the gangster's host prepared a perfectly cooked 20-pound roast served with delicious sauces and gravies. But his personal favorite was spaghetti, so that's what he served the gangsters most. There was a ton of booze in the kitchen, but whereas Probasco was drunk most of the time, Dillinger and Van Meter rarely drank and never hard liquor. Men on the run had to stay alert at all times. Anyone who came to visit saw Dillinger on the couch casually flipping through a magazine, and Van Meter standing in the room holding a machine gun trained on them. Dillinger enjoyed reading, Van Meter did not. He mostly listened to the police calls on the radio. The men chuckled at reports of their many sightings across the country. The press was a mess. A United Press article illustrated it best. "Dillinger is mild-mannered and never swears, but is evil-tempered and curses all the time. He is a maniac, but quite sane, and a moron, but intelligent. Dillinger has robbed 5, 16, 32, 78 banks in 4, 6, 7, 8 states and killed 2, 3, 11, and 17 men. If you want to verify this, ask Dillinger. You'll find him in Wisconsin, Montana, Arizona, Minnesota, Ohio, Texas, or Idaho." Johnny got a good laugh when he heard Chicago and Frederick A. Weber was arrested because he looked like Dillinger. The man was considering cosmetic surgery. The irony. The men laid low, but only for a few days. Then they started going out, freaking the frack out of Probasco, who figured cops would trail them back to his place any minute now. Dillinger dyed his hair and new mustache black and wore gold-rimmed glasses. His new face worked since no one batted an eye when he moved among crowds. He got a kick out of this and kept pushing the envelope. Sometimes the men were gone for a few days, probably casing banks, but mostly they went to the movies, gangster movies of course, went out dancing, visited cabarets, and went to the Chicago World's Fair twice, while Chicago Cubs fan Dillinger was itching to catch a ball game. Art O'Leary visited the outlaws pretty much every other day. It usually took the investigator about 2 hours to complete the 15-minute drive from his house to the hideout. He had to lose any tail the feds or the Chicago Dillinger Squad put on him. After he left his apartment, he would drive and park to check if anyone followed him. He'd do this a few times. Once he drove down a side street with no cars following him, he'd pull into a parking spot, exchange his hat for a cap, and walk to the nearest elevated station. He'd take a train to Probasco's neighborhood, hail a cab, dismiss it about 2 blocks from the hideout, and continue on foot. Pickett, who didn't go as often, followed similar procedures, but sometimes he couldn't be arsed and drove directly to Probasco's and parked his large car almost in front of the door. If only the Bureau or the Chicago Police Department had skilled tailors, or even bothered to put a tail on the 2 men at all, which they didn't. Many people contacted Pickett who wanted to connect with Johnny. One day, Pearl Hellman, aka Pearl Elliott, who had helped Dillinger break out his buddies from the Indiana State Prison, showed up with a man wearing a Michigan City prison suit. "This is Joseph Byer. He's an old sweetheart of mine and I can vouch for him." Mr. Byer said he'd been granted a 3-day leave from the state prison to attend his mother's funeral. He hoped Dillinger would accept him into the gang so he didn't have to go back. But when O'Leary asked Johnny, he said, "Yes, I know that fellow Byer. He's a stool pigeon. Have nothing to do with him." That puts Pearl Hellman off the list of right people too for bringing him around. Pearl and the furloughed prisoner were indeed trying to locate the outlaw, to sell him out for the reward money and a reduced sentence. Byer returned to prison. Art and Lou had several mysterious female visitors who were so sus that they wondered if there was such a thing as G-women. A gorgeous woman claiming to be Mrs. Alvin Karpis told O'Leary, "I haven't seen Alvin in several years, and I have to work to support a little girl. Right now we're very hard up, and I don't know what to do." Maybe Dillinger could help her get in touch with her husband or give her some money. When O'Leary informed Dillinger, he said, "Sure, I know Karpis, but I never heard him mention a wife or daughter. I don't know what to say about that woman. I think you better stay clear of her." Another striking blonde arrived, saying she was an old friend of Evelyn Frechette, Dillinger's imprisoned girlfriend. O'Leary again went to the Probasco place, but Dillinger shouted, "That's the bug! She's nothing but a G-woman. Throw her out." Pat Charrington and Opal Long were regulars. They complained to Pickett about their financial hardships. They had some jewelry stashed in a safety deposit box in a bank in Chicago and money in an account. Pickett arranged for an elderly lawyer, Mr. McGarren, to retrieve it for a fee. Well, he was instantly grabbed by G-men who grilled him at the banker's building for 2 hours. He had nothing, so they let him go. But did he have their money? "Yes, here's your money, less $50 for my fee. And as for your jewelry, it can stay there until hell freezes over before I go back." On June 2nd, Captain Steege's Dillinger Squad arrested Charrington and Long when they tried to claim their jewelry from the safety deposit box. Opal pleaded guilty to harboring and was given a 6-month sentence at the Minneapolis workhouse. On July 7, 1934, after a trial, Pat was sentenced to 2 years for harboring John Dillinger and John Hamilton. Louis Pickett told John Dillinger that the St. Paul lawyers wanted to get paid. Johnny handed O'Leary a note and asked him to go to his father in Mooresville, Indiana. O'Leary found John's half-brother Hubert Dillinger at his filling station in Indianapolis. Hubert took O'Leary aside and nodded in the direction of a man. "Be careful what you say. That fellow hanging around here is Art McGinnis." Oh, Art McGinnis, the stool pigeon that John Dillinger just couldn't seem to shake. "What's that rat doing here?" "I want him around where I can keep an eye on him." O'Leary told Hubert, "I have a note from Johnny for your dad. McGinnis will be asking you who I am. Tell him I'm a G-man and that you're driving me out to Mooresville to talk to your father." They arrived half an hour later, and old man Dillinger walked up to them. "How's Johnny?" "He's fine, Mr. Dillinger." O'Leary handed Senior Junior's note. He read it, took a match from his pocket and burned it, quite aware that he was being watched by real G-men hiding in the woods. John Sr. went to his barn and returned with $3,000 neatly wrapped in a newspaper. As Hubert drove back to Indianapolis, he told O'Leary, "If you see Johnny when you get back, mention to him that Art McGinnis is at the filling station with me." The feds never noticed O'Leary's visit to the farm. However, McGinnis had his suspicions and told Earl Connolly. but the G-men never figured out who the man pretending to be a federal agent was. Put a tail on the lawyer, men! Sheesh. O'Leary arrived at Probasco's house in Chicago that night. Dillinger, in a foul mood, was pacing up and down the room, and Van Meter was distraught. What's wrong? They had heard the news on the radio. It was Tommy Carroll. After ditching convict Nelson, Tommy Carroll's lady Jean Delaney rejoined her boo, and the duo started casing banks in Iowa. On June 6th, the couple headed to her parents' house in St. Paul, Minnesota, to give her mom big news in person. The following morning, June 7th, Tommy and Jean were cruising along in his tan Hudson when they stopped for gas and a service job at a filling station in Waterloo, Iowa. When the attendant lifted up the front floorboard to put water in the battery, he noticed several license plates under a floor mat. Very sus. He called the Waterloo police station. But when detectives Emil Stephan and P.E. Walker arrived, Carroll was already gone. They searched the streets for an hour looking for the tan sedan, but got nothing. They headed back to the police station, and what do you know? The Hudson was parked across the street near a tavern. They checked it out. The car was locked and empty, but Stephan noticed a cloth covering something. Could it be guns? They decided to wait. A little after noon, a man and a woman exited from the tavern's rear door in the alley. Carroll opened the Hudson's passenger door for Delaney and walked around to the driver's side door. The detectives got out of their car. Walker said, "Hey, just a minute there. Who are you?" Carroll said, "Who are you?" Walker grabbed Carroll by the shoulder and said, "I'm an officer and I'd like to talk to you for a minute." Carroll reached for his .380 Colt automatic in his pocket, but Walker punched him in the nose. Tommy slipped and fell on his butt and dropped his gun under the car. He snatched it up, and the ex-boxer was on his feet the next instant and started running down the sidewalk. Detective Stephan drew his revolver and fired. His bullet struck Carroll under the left armpit. Delaney screamed. Tommy dropped his gun and stumbled into an alley. Walker shot Carroll 3 times. He fell down and stayed down. Stephan ran up and demanded to know the injured man's name, Tommy Carroll, but he refused to answer any more questions. He only said, "I've got $700 on me. Be sure the little girl gets it. She doesn't know what it's all about." Carroll was taken to the St. Francis Hospital, and Jean Delaney was placed under arrest. 2 federal agents from the St. Paul office arrived that afternoon and questioned the dying man for 45 minutes. He said nothing and only begged the cops to allow him to see Jean one last time. They refused. Tommy Carroll died at 6:55 that evening, alone. Carroll's real wife, Viola, angrily told reporters that Delaney was a home wrecker and a rat. They just turned that woman loose so that she would get Tommy and lead him into a police trap. If I ever see her, it will be just too bad for her. The federal men questioned Jean until 4:15 a.m., but she had nothing useful to say, not even to the persuasive assistant director Hugh Clegg. She only said she reunited with Carroll because of the baby, conceived at Little Bohemia, and Carroll's promise to marry her. That's why they went to her mom. Sadly, the shock of watching her man get shot down caused a miscarriage. The Madison Capital-Times unleashed on the feds, using a pregnant woman as bait in some messed up sting just to get John Dillinger? For shame, sirs, for shame. Judge Patrick Stone revoked Delaney's probation and sent her to prison to serve a year and a day for violation of her parole. The gas station attendant who alerted the cops quickly left town. It was a smart move. Babyface Nelson arrived a few days later to kill him. Well, he could take a number. At Probasco's place, Art O'Leary saw John Dillinger's eyes full of vengeance. Johnny said, "We'll have to make a little trip out to Waterloo, Van, and take care of those guys." Homer Van Meter shook his head. "We won't have any time left for robbing banks, what with taking care of people." Johnny's black list of who he wanted to whack grew by the minute. Straight in at number 1 was Harold Reinecke, the federal agent whom Dillinger believed had mistreated his girl Billy Frechette. Next were Captain Matt Leach and stool pigeon Art McGinnis. Down the list were Sergeant Frank Reynolds of the Chicago Dillinger Squad, Emil Wanotka, the owner of Little Bohemia, the 3 deputies who had fatally shot John Hamilton near St. Paul, and now those responsible for Tommy Carroll's death. Dillinger, overwhelmed by guilt and self-pity, told Van Meter he was a jinx to all his friends. The Whitecappers, William Shaw and crew, had been caught. His partners in Kentucky and East Chicago, Harry Copeland, and the 3 women at Little Bohemia. Russell Clark had been sentenced to life, and Harry Pierpont and Charles Makeley would soon be executed. Walter Dietrich, Eddie Green, John Hamilton, and Tommy Carroll were dead, and Billy was as good as dead, in federal prison in Milan, Michigan, a few cells down from Catherine Kelly, the wife of Machine Gun Kelly. Johnny sat silently for hours. Then he wrote a letter to his father and sent it to Mooresville via messenger. He wrote, "Chicago, Illinois. Dad, I got here all right and find I still have some friends who will not sell me out. Would like to have stayed longer at home. I enjoyed seeing you and the kids so much. I've been over lots of country, but home always looks good to me. Tell that little Francis to keep smiling." He didn't say he had recently met an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph G., who promised to drive him to Mexico as their son for $10,000. He merely said, "This sure keeps a fella moving. I will be leaving soon, and you will not need to worry anymore. Tell the girls hello. Hope everybody's well. Johnny." John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter had different reactions to their friend's passing. Van Meter swore he'd never die like that, gunned down in some filthy alley, and stayed close to home. Dillinger was like nuts to that. He was gonna enjoy life to the fullest. The day after Carroll's death, Friday, June 8th, Lewis Pickett was at Wrigley Field to watch the Chicago Cubs play the Cincinnati Reds. At the front of the park, Pickett heard, "Hiya, Council!" Dillinger, an avid Cubs fan, waved and headed over. Lewis Pickett freaked. He had just swerved to avoid another Cubs fan, Captain Steege of the Dillinger squad. Now a smiling Johnny just hippity-hoppitied over to him. Pickett hissed, "Fuzz! Big Fuzz!" Fuzz was underworld speak for cops. Big Fuzz was reserved for the higher-ups. Dillinger quickly ducked into the nearest entrance, but reluctantly left after a few innings. Still, he returned to the hideout in high spirits. He'd attended his first ball game in nearly a year. Johnny told Van, "Well, you're going to Indianapolis with me tonight. We're going to start cutting down our list." The 2 outlaws were in Indianapolis the next morning looking for Art McGinnis, but the police spy was gone. O'Leary's visit may have spooked him, or perhaps Hubert warned him, unwilling to be part of any killings. Dillinger and Van Meter drove around for some time, and then in the business section of Indianapolis they saw him, and McGinnis saw them. Art mixed in with the crowd of shoppers entering a department store and disappeared. Well, McGinnis knew his number was up again. Dillinger and Van Meter returned to Chicago. On a warm summer's night in June, Rita Polly Hamilton was hanging out at the Barrel of Fun nightclub when she made eye contact with a dapper-looking dandy who'd been staring at her. He approached and asked, "What would happen if I called you up some night?" "Smooth." She threw him a big smile, "Try and see," and eagerly offered her number. The man introduced himself as Jimmy Lawrence and said he worked as a clerk for the Board of Trade. "The scars? Yeah, it was a car accident?" John Dillinger, with Billy Frechette out of reach, was moving on, sort of. Polly was a Billy clone, right down to the troubled youth and Native American heritage. At 13, she ran away from her home in Fargo, North Dakota, and ultimately ended up working as a lady of the night for Anna Sage, a local madam who ran a brothel out of a hotel in Gary, Indiana. In 1929, Polly married a Gary police officer, but divorced him 4 years later. Meanwhile, Anna Sage got in deep with the East Chicago mob and had a boyfriend, Mark Zarkovich of the East Chicago Police Department. John called Polly the next day and picked her up after work. They hopped in a cab, went to the Stables nightclub for dinner and dancing, and just like that, Polly became Johnny's girlfriend. The first week or so, Dillinger waited for his honey, Countess, or Cleopatra to get off work at the S&S sandwich shop in Chicago. He was careful not to go inside, but some people in the store told Polly that her dandy boyfriend looks just like John Dillinger. Polly always maintained she had no idea who he was, but she must have known something didn't scan. Either way, she forever pleaded ignorance, as any seasoned mole would. The flamboyant yegg not only adopted a new look, but also altered his persona. Polly thought he was one of the shyest fellas I ever met, but I liked him a lot. Many thought the shy and reserved man with his glasses, thin mustache, prim clothing, trimmed and painted eyebrows, and manicured nails was a, pardon the word, sissy. But anyone who paid attention saw that lurking beneath that wimpy Lawrence face was a tough SOB and thrill-seeker who thrived on pressing his luck. Case in point, Johnny went with Polly to the Chicago Police Building on State Street because she had to apply for a permit to waitress in a Chicago Loop hotel. A permit was required ever since an outbreak of dysentery the previous summer. Dillinger lingered in the crowded waiting room, and when no one recognized him, the adrenaline junkie got more bold and daring, and pulled the same stunt 3 more times. At first, he walked up and down hallways, casually bumping into police officers. Then he ducked in and out of crowded squad rooms, and eventually he walked into Chief of Detectives William Shoemaker's office. No one recognized him. After the story was leaked to the Chicago Times, Shoemaker was severely reprimanded and demoted. Some 3 weeks into their stay at the Probasco cottage, John Dillinger, dressed to the nines, headed out again. Van Meter asked, "Where are you going?" Dillinger, expecting another lecture, said, "A man has to go out and have a little fun once in a while." Van muttered, "That reminds me of Marie." The Fed shadowed Marie Marion Conforti, but Sam Cowley messed up like he was Melvin Purvis and yanked her detail. She wasn't gonna go back to Van Meter, right? Right? Wrong. On June 14th, Cowley received a call from Conforti's foster mother. Marie had disappeared. Cowley could kick himself. 2 weeks to the day after Purvis had let Helen Gillis slip through his fingers, the blunder that had brought in Cowley, the noob committed the same sin. The day before, Van Meter, dressed in a snazzy outfit, wearing pince-nez glasses as his chosen disguise, had contacted one of Conforti's girlfriends and told her to tell Marie he wanted to reunite. Conforti threw some things in an overnight bag and met Van on a random street corner and vanished. The reunited couple rented a room at the home of William Finnerty and his wife Ella in Calumet City, Illinois, under the names Mr. and Mrs. Henry Adams. Finnerty, a railroad brakeman who had once been involved in Al Capone's syndicate, had met Van in a gambling house. Finnerty didn't seem to know who Van Meter was. If he had, the rent would have been 10 times the $15 a week he charged him. Van Meter kept paying the $25 a day to Probasco and stayed at the hideout every now and then. That day, Marie Conforti's probation was yanked. On the same day, Helen Gillis failed to report to her probation officer and an arrest warrant was issued for her. Babyface Nelson had taken his wife to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Mr. Pickett and Mr. O'Leary figured they could make some extra money on their client John Dillinger's publicity value. After discussing their ideas with Johnny, they offered a reporter for the Chicago American newspaper an exclusive 3-hour interview with the famous outlaw for $50,000 plus travel expenses. The paper was interested and the details were worked out, but ultimately the idea was considered morally ambiguous, but probably because of the hefty price tag. Maybe the American could cover Dillinger's surrender. Well, Johnny was game for anything short of surrender. How about an autobiography? John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter would record their stories on a recording device, and O'Leary would get them a ghostwriter. Why stop there? They would add a talking motion picture, a crime does not pay flick. Johnny and Van would show their machine guns, pistols, and bulletproof vests, then give a detailed account of one of their non-lethal bank robberies. Dillinger would warn the youth of America against following in their footsteps. He would explain how they were hunted like rats and driven from one crime to another just to buy another day's protection. Van Meter wasn't interested in the crime does not pay bit, but loved the idea of a movie. The duo spoke about it often. It dawned on O'Leary that making a motion picture would not fall under lawyer-client privilege and could get him convicted, but the money was just too good to pass up. John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter read in the newspapers that U.S. Attorney General Homer Cummings had issued a shoot-on-sight order on them, and they were livid. When O'Leary swung by that evening, Dillinger handed him a slip of paper, 2 names and addresses. Harold H. Reinecke, Melvin H. Purvis. Dillinger told O'Leary to check them, but the investigator and Pickett agreed not to have that sort of thing going on. The two raced over to the hideout. Pickett fumed. "What? Just what are you planning to do?" Dillinger explained, "They're out to kill me, aren't they? Why should I sit around and wait for it? We're gonna be parked in front of their houses one of these nights and get them before they get us. That's all." "That's all? Have you gone crazy?" Dillinger leaned back and watched Pickett wave his arms and shout courtroom style, "Don't you realize what a stunt like that would mean? They call out the army and place the town under martial law and hang me from the nearest lamppost. Besides, Purvis has to carry out the orders that are given him." Dillinger smirked. "We'll leave Purvis out of it then. But there's nothing going to stop me from killing that son of a bitch Reinecke. He pushed Billy around for days without letting her eat or sleep and smacked her, and then he lied about her in court. Since all that happened, he's been living on borrowed time." Pickett told him, "You're not gonna kill anybody. Just forget about it. Art and I have gone far enough for you as it is. If you tried to pull off a general massacre, I'm not with you any longer, Johnny." Dillinger said, "All right, counsel. We'll let it ride for the time being." Now here's the thing. This conversation may never have happened. It is entirely possible that Pickett made this up as a testimony to his upstanding moral character, making it seem he was personally responsible for stopping a massacre. Ain't history grand? But Johnny and Van had more shocking plans. According to O'Leary and Pickett, that is. After visiting the boys one afternoon, O'Leary entered Pickett's office, laughing. "What's up, Art?" "Woo, just, give me a minute. Get this, the men had found a new project. All the banks in Platteville, Wisconsin." Pickett stormed out with O'Leary in tow, drove over to Rabasco's house, busted down the door and grabbed Dillinger. "What's this O'Leary tells me about you fellas wanting to rob all the banks in Platteville? Don't you know that's my hometown?" Dillinger looked innocent. "Platteville, Wisconsin? That's my hometown. Well, what of it? You don't own the banks, do you?" "What the hell? Of course I don't own the banks. But my mother and my father and my brothers live there. I was raised there. I know everybody in the town." Well, Dillinger had cased all the banks and made all the gets. Here, check it out. It's a super easy jug. Pickett realized his client was Frankenstein's monster. His friends and family would get hurt as he burned down the village. Dillinger told him not to worry. There'd be no shooting. Scout's honor. The police department wasn't worth a damn. It would take him 10 minutes tops. Van Meter cut in. "Quit your beefing. If her family loses any money in the banks, we'll kick it back to you." Pickett, his face bright red, raged. "I'm telling you, Johnny, you can't do this. Everybody knows I'm your lawyer. If you go up to Platteville, it'll look like I cased the banks and put my hometown on the spot." Dillinger sighed. "I suppose that's true. I can't stand for anything like that, Johnny. You're getting mighty close to home now. If you go shooting up Platteville, I'm through with you, Johnny. I mean it. You and I will be through." "All right, counsel. Don't get so burned up about it. To be honest with you, I don't like the idea of that Mississippi River cutting off our retreat. That's bad. So maybe we'll just postpone your town." As the two left the house, Van Meter whispered to a grinning O'Leary, "Why don't you keep your mouth shut anyway?" The two dead men walking, Harry Pierpont and Charles Makeley, were at the Ohio State Prison awaiting the electric chair. Pierpont's mom, Lena, visited Louis Pickett's office several times. One time, she brought a note her son had smuggled out addressed to John Dillinger. Pierpont asked Johnny to attempt a rescue if at all feasible and added a map of the section of the prison where he was held. He pleaded for him to hurry up. They would soon install new electric gates, which made a breakout nigh impossible. He said that Dillinger was under no obligation to help him, as they were now even, and ended, "If you can't make it, Johnny, I'll see you in hell. Harry." O'Leary gave Johnny the Pierponts' address, and he visited the grief-stricken mother. Sadly, he had no means to break her son out, but gave her some money to pay for lawyers. Once Dillinger was healed, it was obvious to everyone but him that his face hadn't changed all that much. When he visited Harry's old girlfriend, Mary Kinder, he grinned and said, "Guess who?" She said, "You look like you got the mumps or something, Johnny." He laughed. Had Miss Levi been able to get a new trial for Pierpont and Makeley? Nope, both boys were going to fry. He was silent, then said in a serious tone she'd never heard him use before, "Mary, of all the gang, you're the only one that's lucky." And then he grinned, "My time is coming, but I don't know when it'll be." On June 22, 1934, Audrey Hancock took out a classified ad in the Indianapolis Star. "Birthday greetings to my darling brother John Dillinger on his 31st birthday. Wherever he may be, I hope he reads this." As she expected, other newspapers yanked the tiny ad and splashed it on their front pages, ensuring Johnny would see it. Meanwhile, John Dillinger threw a 2-day birthday party celebrating both his and Polly's birthday, which was June 23rd. He sent his new love 2 dozen roses, gave her a beautiful amethyst ring, took her to the French casino and nightclub, and danced the night away. Polly was over the moon, but failed to see that Johnny still pined for Billy. On the outlaw's birthday, the Federal Bureau officially designated John Dillinger their public enemy number 1. And Homer Cummings used the new so-called public enemy bill to announce that the federal government offered a reward of $10,000 for the capture of John Dillinger and $5,000 for information leading to his arrest. Cummings avoided the phrase "wanted dead or alive," but the tone was clear. Let's not have a John Dillinger trial ever again. This reward was on top of the $5,000 reward of the 5-state pact, in which Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota each offered $1,000 for Dillinger. The federal government also put $5,000 and $2,500 respectively on the head of Babyface Nelson. Dillinger, clipping all the newspapers, showed the news to Homer Van Meter and grinned. "Looks like my price is going up. Watch Jimmy burn when he finds the government put a cheaper price tag on him than on me. And you, Van, you don't rate at all." Van Meter said, "Nuts to you. You just better watch out somebody doesn't cash in on that reward." Some in the John Dillinger realm were certainly considering doing exactly that. The federal reward money enticed plenty of people to snitch on John Dillinger and crew. Harry Pierpont's mom, Lena, was either angry that Dillinger wouldn't free her son or that he hadn't found them hideout addresses. Either way, she snitched to the feds about the gang's possible bank jobs. None panned out. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, Audrey Russ, also eager for the reward, convinced Inspector Sam Cowley that Van Meter and Dillinger planned to use his place as a hideout again, soon. Cowley redeployed 4 agents round the clock, including Chicago Field Office's newest additions, top marksmen Charles Winstead and Clarence Hurt, who now had to suffer through the daily wrath of a disgruntled Mrs. Russ. On June 26th, our favorite Crown Point mail carrier Robert Volk was at a Cubs game at Wrigley Field when he noticed a familiar face in the upper deck. Wait, could it be? Suddenly, the man came over and sat 2 seats away. Volk started sweating. "This is getting to be a habit," the stranger replied. "It certainly is." "John Dillinger!" Internally screaming, Volk wondered if he should alert one of the Lake County deputy sheriffs who'd driven up with the group sitting lower down, but his friend told him to let it slide. Volk was relieved when the man left after the 7th-inning stretch. On June 27, 1934, the federal agents finally scored a point when Opal Milligan snitched on her boyfriend, Pat Riley. A team of 8 G-men and 2 local cops swarmed an apartment house in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and arrested Pat without incident. Riley hadn't seen the gang since Little Bohemia, so the feds couldn't milk him for info. He pleaded guilty to harboring a fugitive, was fined $2,500, and was sent to serve 21 months at a federal reformatory at El Reno, Oklahoma. Riley's convincing claims that Dillinger was dead sent all the newspapers to the printing presses. But when reporters asked John Dillinger Sr. how he felt about his son's death, he told them, "Yeah, he's doing just fine, kids." For John Dillinger to escape to Mexico, he needed a lot of money. He planned for $100,000, but that was no longer realistic and settled for $35,000, $10,000 for his passage, and $25,000 for living expenses. Just one big bank heist should do it. But the new Dillinger gang was decimated, and for a big job, he needed 3 or 4 more men. Dillinger and Homer Van Meter didn't really want to work with Babyface Nelson anymore, but they had no choice. A new gang member could get a much bigger and safer payday than a share of a bank job by selling them out for the government's reward money. Babyface brought in his old pals from Reno, Nevada, wheelman Joseph Raymond Fatso Negri and torpedo or gunman John Paul Chase. These two, unknown to local law enforcement, could get them cars and guns. Riley's arrest had made the gang a little nervous about the moles. Who else had turned on them? When the reconstituted Dillinger gang met at a schoolhouse outside Chicago to discuss plans for a new job, Babyface told them that Van Meter's ex-girl, Marie Conforti, had made a deal with the feds. They're back together again? Nelson blew a gasket. Negri said Jimmy Nelson got into an argument with Van Meter, something about his living with a girl, and he said the girl is no good, and Van Meter said his girl is good. Nelson had sown the seed of doubt in Van Meter, who drove out to take care of Marie, but Conforti used all her feminine wiles to convince him she'd never sell him out. Van Meter now accused Babyface of nearly getting him to whack his true love. Bullets were about to fly, and Negri and Chase were like, "We're taking a walk, fellas?" But everyone calmed down. Dillinger and Van Meter bent over backwards to please Powder Keg Nelson. Back to business, boys. The bank jobs. They went with Homer Van Meter's suggestion, the Merchants National Bank of South Bend, Indiana. Van Meter had cased it all that week. The local post office made large deposits, making the take easily $100,000, possibly more. Johnny's share would allow him to execute the Mexico plan. June 30th, 1934 was a beautiful summer day. In South Bend, Indiana, a city of 85,000 known for Notre Dame University and the car brand Studebaker, the 29-year-old good-natured policeman Howard Wagner, filling in for a colleague, was directing traffic at the city's busiest crossroad on Michigan Street and Wayne Street. At 11:20 a.m., the assistant postmaster, Robert Schnelly, had just dropped off a heavy canvas bag containing $7,900 at the Merchant Bank. Far less than Homer Van Meter had predicted. Since rumors were a-buzzin' that the bank might be robbed, he had had a police escort for weeks now. After the drop, Snell's escorts, police detectives Edward McCormick and Harry Henderson, drove down a block for a pork chop sandwich lunch. Just then, a local teen, Alex Slaby, a professional boxer wannabe, parked his dad's 1928 Ford around the bank's corner. A black Hudson four-door sedan double-parked right next to him. A bunch of tough-looking men got out, carrying long, slender objects in pillowcases. 2 of them wore overalls and straw hats. One of the well-dressed men poked a gun through Slaby's window and said quietly, "You better scram, kid." Alex gasped, "John Dillinger!" Who was in the robbery? Well, we can only be sure of 3. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Homer Van Meter. The others were most likely John Paul Chase and Nelson's childhood friend Jack Perkins. But everyone disagrees. As the 4 men rounded the corner, Slaby got out and looked into the Hudson. The engine was still running. Alex reached for the keys. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Slaby turned and saw a short man with a boyish face. Nothing. Slaby lottie-dot away from the idling car and went looking for a phone. Babyface didn't follow him and instead walked to the corner of the intersection, holding a machine gun under his jacket. His job was to guard the car. In a store across the street, Slaby got a hold of the desk sergeant and told him about the sedan with an Ohio license plate number C4018. The plate was later traced to Toledo and had also been used at a recent bank robbery in Fostoria, Ohio. The sergeant praised Alex for his bravery, but "Stay out of the way, son, we got this." From the store window, Slaby saw Dillinger and 3 men walk toward the bank. Officer Wagner, still directing traffic, appeared oblivious. Dillinger gave a slight nod and Van Meter broke away. He took up a position in front of the Nisley shoe store to guard the bank's entrance. He carried a nifty, heavily modified sawed-off .351 Winchester rifle with a large-capacity magazine and a Thompson handle. Just as the men entered the bank, South Bend police sent out an all-points bulletin that a holdup was in progress. Cops all over town dropped what they were doing and converged on the bank. June 30th, 1934, 11:32 a.m. Inside the Merchants Bank, nearly 24 customers stood in line, hoping to beat the clock. Closing time was 28 minutes from now. Dillinger liked a big audience. Makes for a better show. He hollered, "This is a stick-up! Everybody stand still!" Only a few people complied. Maybe they didn't hear him. Ahem! Dillinger pulled his Thompson machine gun from the pillowcase, pointed it to the ceiling, and let loose a few short bursts. Some slugs nearly hit the chandelier, and some went through the ceiling up into the second-floor conference room. A white dust cloud descended on Johnny, making the show all the more spectacular. Customers ducked into the rear lobby, in the bank director's private office, under counters, and in bathrooms, locking the door behind them. Everyone else hit the floor. Johnny smiled. He'd gotten everyone's attention. Bruce Bouchard, the manager of a radio distribution company, dropped to the floor in pain. He'd been shot in the hip. The outlaw glanced at him and shrugged. "Sorry." Merchant Bank's Vice President C.W. Cohen, in his office behind the teller cages, ducked under his desk and stayed there. Outside his office, his son and bank officer Delis Cohen and bank director Perry Stolley both froze. They were sure that the guy smiling at them was Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. As far as we know, Dillinger and Floyd never met, and he certainly wasn't there. So, are we saying Johnny's facelift had made him pretty? Pretty Boy Dillinger was the lookout, and Perkins and Chase headed for the 5 teller cages, shoving cash into the pillowcases by the handful. Initially, people outside the Merchants Bank thought the gunfire was some kind of early 4th of July celebration, and that the rifle-toting Homer Van Meter, dressed in overalls and straw hat, was a clown advertising something. So are we saying his facelift made him look like a clown? But when Officer Niels Hansen, standing at the intersection up the road, heard Dillinger's Thompson, he knew there was trouble and ran toward the bank. Patrolman Wagner also heard it and hopped across the interurban tracks toward the bank. He was nearly run over by Samuel Toft, the local meat market owner, who had to swerve and slam his brakes. "I'm driving here." Kenneth Beers, a farmer from Cassopolis, Michigan, stood waiting at a traffic light with his wife and child. His car stalled, and all hell broke loose around him. Van blanketed the street to keep all the police running toward him at bay. Wagner ducked for cover behind Beers' stalled coupe and fired at Van Meter, who threw a few shots in Wagner's general direction. He could have killed him right then and there, but Van didn't want to hit the woman and child. As the gunfire unleashed, some people made a mad dash for cover, while others just froze. What was even happening? Patrolman Sylvester Zell and Emile de Westphaler, on traffic duty a block away, saw people running south. Must be trouble at the bank. They raced over. Meanwhile, Farmer Beers managed to restart his stalled car and took off, leaving Wagner without cover in the middle of the street. The exposed officer started running, but Van Meter took aim and fired. Officer Hansen arrived on the scene just in time to see Officer Wagner go down in a hail of bullets between 2 parked cars. Officer Hansen, at first stunned to see his friend bleeding out, spun around looking for the shooter. There, he locked eyes with Van Meter, pointing his souped-up rifle straight at him. Damn! Patrolman Zell and de Westphaler charged onto the scene, dodging bullets. Hansen screamed at them, "Doc, that guy's gonna shoot us!" The 2 patrolmen hunched behind a Pontiac parked in front of the State Movie Theater and edged closer. Van Meter, doing a weird dance to evade police bullets, alternately fired at Hansen, de Westphaler, and Zell, keeping them all pinned down behind the cars. Then Van grabbed car dealer Arthur Stilson as a shield. When another burst of bullets distracted Van Meter, Stilson broke away and ran straight into Babyface Nelson, who yelled at him to stop and stay put. Stilson froze and watched in awe as Babyface calmly replaced an empty drum from his Thompson with a fresh one. Van's rifle jammed, but equally calm, expertly ejected the magazine, cleared the breech, and slammed in a new clip. Junk dealer Jacob Solomon wandered onto the scene, oblivious. Babyface, feeling magnanimous, told him to scram, or he'd get hurt. Solomon hurried to get to his pal Harry Berg's jewelry store. Berg, fancying himself a bit of a marksman, busted out the door with his automatic pistol, took aim, and shot Nelson square in the back. Bullseye! Nelson, wearing a bulletproof vest, felt as if he had been stung by a giant bee. Enraged, he spun around and fired his Thompson gangster style from the hip at Berg. The man's store was riddled with bullets, but the jeweler wasn't hit. Solomon was. In the leg, up into his abdomen. He limped into the store with Berg and fell to the floor. Van Meter had no clue why Nelson was so angry. More fuzz, maybe? He entered the Nisley shoe store and yelled that everyone had to get out. No one wanted to go outside in the bullet rain, but they complied and formed Van Meter's human shield. Van fired his unique rifle over a woman's shoulder, splitting her eardrums. Customer R.F. Gibson bolted from the group, but ran into a majorly pissed-off babyface. Freeze! Oh, good, a shield. 16-year-old Joseph Pulowski, sitting in his family car outside the Strand Theater, was stunned. Why was no one stopping the gunman? The naive youngin bolted from the car and charged at Nelson. Babyface, distracted by all the cops closing in, never saw him coming. The teen jumped on the outlaw's sword back and shouted, "Shoot him! Grab him!" to no one in particular, and no one in particular heard him. Babyface grunted in pain. What the frack is wrong with the people in this town? He slammed the barrel of his machine gun against the side of Pulowski's head and hurled the dazed teen off his back through his store window. The kid, dizzy and bleeding, scrambled to his feet, but Nelson shot him and hit his hand. When the teen saw the hole in his hand, he fell back in shock. Dillinger and pals heard the war raging outside. So, this wasn't the smoothest robbery, but they had 3 pillowcases stuffed full of money, and surrender wasn't an option. Inside the bank, John Dillinger grabbed 3 hostages, injured radio salesman Bruce Bouchard and bank executives dealers Cohen and Perry Stolley. He held Bouchard out in front of him. Chase grabbed Cohen, Perkins, Stolley. A block away, detectives McCormick and Henderson just finished their tasty pork sandwiches when they heard the restaurant radio request that all police cars proceed to the Merchants Bank immediately. They raced to their car but got hopelessly stuck in the tangled-up traffic. McCormick shouted that he could run faster than Henderson could drive and to throw him a weapon. He got to the bank just as Dillinger, Chase, and Perkins emerged with their hostages. McCormick raised his weapon. Damn, Henderson had handed him a shotgun instead of a rifle. No way he could fire without hitting one of the hostages. Officer Hansen, 30 feet away, aimed his .32-20 revolver but couldn't get a clear shot either. He watched as Perkins put on some sunglasses and the 12-legged blob moved up the street and merged with Homer Van Meter's human shoe store shield. For a brief moment, the hostages and bandits separated, and Hansen, a marksman, fired at Perkins' shoulder hoping to knock the gun out of his hand. Bullseye! Perkins jerked back but didn't flinch. Hansen fired again, aiming for Perkins' head. Blam! Straight to the jaw. Again, the gangster barely flinched, and everyone continued toward the getaway car with their human shields. Hansen couldn't risk another shot. However, Officers Zell and the West Belair were like hostages, smostages, and fired at Dillinger. They hit Chase's human shield Cohen in his left leg. The banker dropped to the sidewalk, unconscious. Seconds later, more bullets. Several went between Stolley's legs and one shredded his pants, but one of the bullets hit the robber just behind Stolley. Bullet magnet Perkins. The blob reached the car. Dillinger let the already injured Bouchard go, and the radio man dropped for cover behind Slavy's Ford. Perkins forced his shield Stolley to stay. Another police bullet aimed at Perkins struck Stolley in the upper thigh. He yelled he was hit and thought he was free, but Perkins, already shot thrice himself, wouldn't hear of it and said, "Keep on going, you're going with us." After a few painful steps, Stolley yelled, "Enough!" Dillinger told Perkins to leave him. "Come on, get in, we're going now." Finally, Perkins let Stolley go, and as the man ducked for cover, Perkins took a shot at him, but the bullet whistled past Stolley's head, barely missing his left ear. He later said, "Thankfully, his aim was as rotten as his morals." Meanwhile, Detective McCormick got a bead on Van Meter. One bullet struck his arm, another his forehead at the hairline, drilling along the scalp 4 inches before coming out again. Homer faltered and dropped to his knees, but Dillinger seized him by the collar and yanked him into the car. Johnny slid behind the wheel, but Babyface Nelson came running and yelled at Dillinger to move over. Johnny did, and Babyface got behind the wheel. Detective Harry Henderson had untangled himself from traffic hell and stopped 30 feet behind the Hudson. With the hostages out of the way, Henderson shot his .38 service revolver at the driver through the Hudson's rear window 3 times. One bullet passed through Nelson's hat. Had the taller Dillinger been at the wheel, he would have been hit in the back of the head. The outlaws returned fire. Henderson said, "Someone started firing at me, so I had to duck to the floor. As I was down, I heard the bandit car drive away. I couldn't believe it." Powerful Hudson, riddled with police bullets, raced toward the city limits. It careened around a corner, almost ramming a car driven by a local dance teacher. Several police vehicles gave chase. Officer Sylvester Zell hopped on a running board of a passing police truck as it followed the Hudson heading south. Motorcycle cop Bert Olmsted got on his 1929 Harley and tried to keep up with the fleeing gangsters. Detectives Lucius LaFortune and Fred Miller gave pursuit in Radio Car 9. Patrolman Peter Rudinsky and Arden Klein heard the bulletin about a robbery in progress on their one-way radio and also joined the chase, and hit traffic. Ambulances arrived to take the injured to the hospital, and people emerged from their hiding places and raced to their cars to hightail it out of there in every direction. Their 1930 Studebaker had no siren, so they tooted their horn to break up traffic hell. Radio station WSBT interrupted regular programming to give updates on the bandits' escape route. The South Bend Tribune paid pilot Homer Stalker to take his Stinson Reliant and shadow the crooks by air. 2 officers and a reporter joined him. Rudinsky and Klein Studebaker busted a gas line, killing the car. They were out. Zell, hanging on to the sluggish police truck, saw the much more powerful Hudson disappear in the distance. They were out. 10 miles outside South Bend, Olmsted had pushed his Harley's engine to the limit. It fried and died. He was out. He lamented to a reporter, "I was doing 80 miles per hour, all the cycle had, and they just walked away from me." Only Radio Car 9 was still in the running until they got to Knox, 45 miles southwest, when they hit a stretch of roofing nails and blew out 2 tires. They were out. Perhaps it was for the best. The poorly equipped cops were no match for the heavily armed gangsters. They didn't even wear bulletproof vests. The Dillinger crew ran into trouble themselves. After their near miss in South Bend, the Hudson sideswiped a lady's vehicle. She fainted and drove into a ditch. When she came to, she was bruised but alive. On a back road near Plymouth, they blew out a tire. But like a Formula One race car pit crew, they quickly switched wheels, leaving the old wheel and jack on the road as souvenirs. Meanwhile, the cops regrouped in Springfield, raided the local National Guard armory, and set out to find them dirty crooks. The chartered plane didn't notice the gang split up. Some got in a Ford stashed along the route. Then they lost the trail. A couple of kids outside their home in Grovertown, Indiana, heard a roar of the engines as 2 getaway cars blew past. They were going too fast to make the turn marked on the Gits. The 2 men in the Ford overshot the turn, while the 3 men in the Hudson took the corner on 2 wheels, nearly flipping over, and ended up on the road sideways. The kids noticed one man in the back seat pulling the driver over the front seat to the back, while the man in the passenger seat slipped behind the wheel. Once the Ford made a U-turn and caught up, the gangsters took off again. There was actually no need for speed. The kids didn't see the first police car for another hour. It was followed by another 25 law enforcement cars. They stopped to check the skid marks and asked the kids what they saw. By 1 p.m., near Goodland, Indiana, the gangsters ditched the Hudson at the far end of Herb Farrell's farm. They grabbed the license plates and all got into the Ford, with 2 men squeezed into the rumble seats. Farrell strolled over to the abandoned Hudson with shattered front and back windows and blood on the back seat. The Hudson's gas tank was empty. He called the police, who towed it to South Bend, where the bureau, local police technicians, and fingerprint squad could investigate. Their findings eventually revealed which gang had pulled the job. Vice President Cohen insisted that John Dillinger was the first man through the door, but others weren't so sure. His face was, different. Yay, success! Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach believed such a violent bank heist could only have been carried out by the ruthless Italian gangsters from Detroit or Toledo. Oh, Matt. Once it became clear this had been a John Dillinger and Friends gig, the most dramatic bank robbery to date settled it. John Dillinger was officially the modern Jesse James. Both Bureau boss J. Edgar Hoover and Indiana Governor Paul McNutt were fuming over the latest display of inadequacy in dealing with Dillinger. Hoover and McNutt vowed to rearrange their respective departments again. South Bend had paid the price for its bravery. Officer Wagner died 10 minutes after arriving at the hospital, and 6 citizens were wounded. Jeweler Harry Berg was unfazed. A few hours later, a sign outside his store read, "Not hurt, open for business." At 10 p.m., the gang arrived at the schoolhouse northwest of Chicago, where Fatso Negri was waiting. Both Van Meter and Babyface Nelson lay on the floor in agony. Van was bleeding heavily, and Nelson was still reeling from Berg's shot in the back. As per usual, Nelson divided the money into neat little piles, the operative word being little. Dillinger's face fell. The total haul was a mere $28,439, a little over $665,000 today. Each share wasn't the $20,000 Van Meter had calculated, but only $5,700. This couldn't get him to Mexico. He had to rob another bank. But the job got crazy dangerous. In Greencastle, no one had fired a single shot, and now fearless citizens were getting in on the action. The cops were even shooting their human shields. What's next? On July 1st, John Dillinger took the injured Homer Van Meter to James Probasco's house. Probasco, looking for some extra cash, said he was a kinda doctor, the kind of doing some heavy lifting. He had veterinarian training. He pulled hair out of Van's wound with a tweezer and covered it with cotton and tape. Van Meter took one look. "So, I want a real doctor. Now." They called Dr. Harold Cassidy, but he had no idea why they needed him and didn't arrive until the next day. Cassidy found Dillinger in the kitchen, Van Meter half passed out on the living room couch, and Probasco in his face, cussing him out. The doctor was like, "Dude, chill, these guys weren't his responsibility no more." But sure, he'd help. Jeez. Cassidy removed several pieces of chipped bone, doused the wounds on the arm and head with an antiseptic and iodine, bandaged Van and gave him a tetanus shot. He should be alright. Van Meter, feeling way better now, fumed about the man who shot him. He read his name in the paper. They should go back and finish Officer McCormick. "We can't afford to let a guy go on living that can shoot that straight." Dillinger cracked up. "We'll go down there, Van." The following day, Monday, July 3rd, Dillinger, Chase, Nelson, and Negri met at a small lake on Chicago's northwest side. Chase had a new job, a train robbery. On July 3rd, Harry Pierpont and Charles Makeley's lady lawyer Jesse Levi managed to stay their executions, which had been scheduled for July 13th. Pierpont and Makeley were allowed to address the media. Harry spat, "Newspapers put us here. We didn't do the Lima job. Indiana authorities from the State House down know who did that job, but they built the case against us because we were hot. We owe Dillinger nothing. He owes us even less. We both hope he's never caught. He's one of the grandest fellows that ever lived. No, of course we don't know where he is." John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter felt less and less at ease at Probasco's place and worried they'd be found soon. One day, they heard their host fight with an associate and say, "I don't care if you bring the cops. Go ahead and see what happens to them when they get here." Dillinger and Van Meter were not amused. But the final straw came on July 4th. While the boys were away, Lewis Pickett had gone bar hopping with Probasco. Later that afternoon, Johnny and Van arrived in the maroon Ford, doing the customary 3 circles around the block before parking to shake off any tails. They saw Pickett park his large car half on the sidewalk and walk to the cottage arm in arm with Probasco. The 2 outlaws waited. Pickett found stacks of money in the house, and he and Probasco headed out to do some more bar hopping. After they left, Dillinger and Van Meter went in, packed up their belongings, and left without so much as a goodbye note. Probasco was furious and blamed Pickett for scaring his meal ticket tenants off. Their friendship was over. Johnny officially moved in with Polly, who had just moved in with Anna Sage and her son Steve. Demeter was disturbed by Dillinger's newly found connections and told him, "I've got no use for that whole East Chicago bunch. You're going to get yourself killed." Homer Demeter was a prophet. Find out in the next episode. See you there.